Salone del Mobile and Stir present Design Voices, Think Next, produced by Dog Ear.
Welcome to the live podcast from Salone del Mobile Milano.
We are Amit Gupta, Editor-in-Chief of Stir, and William Bagnoli and Charlotte Bräuer of QA Studio. What's happening today? What are the ideas spreading in the fair? Follow us and let us meet the protagonist. We welcome Bryan Young and Marius Myking. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Marius, for joining us for this live podcast, which is going to be aired on Salone and on various Dog Ear platforms.
Thank you for having us. Yeah, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
A quick introduction to our protagonist, Bryan Young, who founded Young Projects LLC in New York in 2010. His work includes building interiors, objects, material prototyping, and furniture. The studio explores a variety of methods, breaking traditional techniques for fabrication, hand-pulling plaster, growing crystals, burning things, to name a few. Bryan grew up in South California, completed Bachelor of Arts from UC Berkeley in 1997, and received his Master of Architecture with distinction from Howard University in 2003. Thank you, Bryan, for joining us.
Thank you. It's amazing to be here.
We have Marius Myking here. Marius Myking was born in 1983 in Norway, studied interiors and furniture design, completed master's degree in interior design at Pratt Institute, Brooklyn in New York. Marian has been heading product design for Snøhetta, an international architecture and design company headquartered in Oslo. Snøhetta began as a collaborative architectural and landscape workshop and has remained true to its transdisciplinary way of thinking since its inception, striving to enhance our sense of surroundings, identity, and relationship to others and physical spaces we inhabit, whether feral or human-made. Welcome, Marius.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Where do you draw your inspiration from?
Well, I think it's interesting that you have an architect that's interested in product design and material prototyping, and you have a furniture product designer who's working in an architecture firm. So in some ways, maybe a good place to start is, for us at Young Projects, we're often looking at materiality, fabrication. What are the intrinsic qualities that might exist within a material, and how through a process of manipulating those materials we can achieve new aesthetics, unexpected results, and begin to incorporate that material research at the scale of buildings.
And for us in Snøhetta, we started from the get-go. Snøhetta was started as a multidisciplinary studio, and getting these multidisciplinary expertises in-house is a strong driver for us. It informs how we work. It informs our prototyping, being able to have these different perspectives of anything that we develop, from small scale to a larger scale.
And taking the question for inspiration forward, nature, music, sound, various of the senses with human emotion attach and reflect on. What would you reflect on? What informs your practice when it comes to nature or any other senses?
I guess you could call it nature, but in a lot of our material experiments, we're interested in the moment in which we can't necessarily control what the outcomes are going to be. So whether it's casting aluminum, for example, or pulling plaster, or other techniques that we've used to prototype materials, there's a certain entropy to the material process. And as we're working through fabrication, it's those moments in which we can't quite control what we're going to realize in the end that are really exciting. Quite often, it's through the iterative process of design that we begin to realize what the aesthetic qualities are. So it's an interesting idea for a designer, for an architect, to not necessarily control the outcome, but to take a step back and allow for a kind of looseness within the design process. In that regard, I think it relates to a kind of natural quality of biology or how things begin to develop in nature.
Yeah, we think of this or practice this in very much the same way. We love working with projects where we can build on what we call a semi-controllable outcome, where the process is really what defines the outcome, not our personal taste or aesthetic emotion, but the process and the setups that we can actually control and facilitate for great projects to sort of happen, rather than going into always too much detail, trying to control something to be something that it doesn't want to be.
You want to go again?
I'd just like to jump
Okay,
in.
yeah, sure.
Let's make it a
Yeah,
conversation.
yes, absolutely.
No, I think it's interesting, and it's certainly something of, I think, our generation, an idea of ambiguity within a kind of material quality. And I think that is, in some ways, quite different than a previous generation that focused on, let's say, truthfulness or clarity. If you take board form concrete, for example, within the concrete is encoded the wood that was used to cast it. And I think what Marius is speaking to, and is also an interest of young projects, that you can begin to kind of tease a material process, maybe with a little bit of an idea of what you want, but in the end, the material itself and how you're working with it begins to dictate the qualities that emerge out of that process.
Absolutely, and we see more and more as well in this. You could call it prototyping, but it's also prototyping of our imagined future things, spaces, experiences. How are all these things coming together? Where do we want to go? And focus on the process of how can we possibly get there? What usually happens is that through this process, we learn new things, we get new experiences, and that in turn informs the project. Attacking it this way, it frees us as designers, as project managers, still destined towards a common goal, but letting the process steer itself in some way.
What do you intend to experiment with next?
I mean, that's a tough one. And on our side, we love doing things we haven't done before. In some sense, I think all creatives are literally doing things for the first time over and over again. Right now, we have a very special collaborative project of ours that is exhibited at Alcova. And it's attacking things with a new approach. So together with the Studio Plastique and Fornace Bräuer, we've been able to develop a product that is generated by electronic glass waste. Now, suddenly that means that we maybe have to care less about exactly how it looks like, but it gives us an opportunity to suddenly figuring out that we have to get to know regulations. We have to understand how to get around those regulations. And a project like this, making it first happen in one scale, can only really have an impact when we can start proving a financial sustainability into these projects. So now we've been able to go most of that way and making it available for a wider market, all the while evolving as designers and as people, understanding the bigger picture of bringing something like that to life.
At Young Projects, we're collaborating with Palo Lenti. And actually at Salone this year, we're debuting a series of tiles in which we have recycled stone aggregate. And the way in which we cast the tiles and then slice the tiles begin to reveal different patterns of the stone and different geometries. And Palo Lenti is a company in which sustainability is at the heart of her mission from the very beginning. In the office, it's maybe a little bit interesting because we have a studio of 15 people in Brooklyn, New York, and there's in some ways a scale of experimentation and research that you can do in an office that's quite different than what you can do in a fabrication plant. So in the office, we do things like grow crystals to see the way in which the different elements begin to cling to each other and the formations that can emerge. And at the same time, because we are just an office, we rely very heavily upon collaborative colleagues, whether that's a woodworker or a plaster worker, but going to their shops and learning from their expertise. And again, kind of letting the fabricators, the artisans begin to tell us what makes sense and how it works. And it's this back and forth that really results in something exciting.
I'm going to bring up an identity or the identity of the work and the style of your work, which both of you do. An architect and a product designer here today with us. Marius, your practice has a very, very strong nuances of hyperrealism and deconstructivism. At the same time, every project of yours has its own identity. And how does, Bryan, in your work, when you're working from tiles to furniture and to many other product design, and I was lucky one to receive your book, which you recently launched, does identity become a strong factor when you are informing your practice or your creation?
For us, we attack every project highly conceptually, but also very contextually. That means if it's a product, if it's a building, we aim to develop projects that wouldn't exist without the co-creation between the context that we're in. If that informed by our collaborators and informed by the mutually set ambitions for each project, by having this intensely collaborative model, it allows us to constantly design things that are not designed for us. We aim to design hopefully for a better future for people, and for the expectations or the ambitions that we try to aim or try to land on together.
Yes, interesting question. I think a quick look through the book might suggest that from a stylistic perspective, the work of Young Projects is quite diverse. And so how do you find identity within projects of varying scale? Even within the architectural projects, they're quite different in terms of material application, formal complexity, structural complexity. I think we spoke a lot about the material process. We're also quite interested in ideas of the figure and manipulating figure-ground relationships. We're interested in, let's say, a kind of tectonic that emerges out of how you actually make buildings and structural complexity. We're also interested in ideas of typology and how you can begin with perhaps a known entity, but then through the design process begin to manipulate and transform that typology into something unexpected.
No, I mean, keeping it a conversation because it's I think we recently launched a new project that is highly driven maybe by our architectural experience, and it's a pendant lighting series for an Italian brand called Lotus, or previous known as Studio Italia, and this had the starting point of creating something that can enhance space. And we always talk about prepositions, meaning your body in relation to an object in space, below, next to, above, and so on. And by using that mentality or that approach, we wanted to create something that is perceived as functional and beautiful from all angles, meaning below, above, next to, and so on. And it led into this pendant series that is within a very well-known typology of these white glass pendants. However, working with the details and maybe hiding the technical solutions within, we were able to have this 360 luminous glow coming out. Also meaning that the lamp itself should be as functional and as beautiful from above even.
Shall I?
Absolutely.
No, I mean, when Marius speaks to the relationship of, let's say, an object and a viewer and how that might shift as one changes their adjacency to that. In this case, I think it's a product. Yeah. But I think it's very true with architecture as well. The notion of a static image of a building is a fallacy. And often, in getting back to identity, and in the book, we write extensively about generating spatial experiences in which there is perhaps a contradiction or a conflict within the space, that as you move through it, the spatial hierarchy, what you understand as a solid, what you understand as a void, begins to shift. And it's that narrative of realizing that you can manipulate architectural language in order to create something that is much richer as an experience and engaging than if you have something that is static and defined and never changing.
So any product which you have designed which got informed by a built environment or a space, or any space you've built which got inspiration or got informed by a product design?
I'm just gonna jump in. There's a 3-project sequence in the book where we talk about 6 packs, and they all talk about part-to-whole relationships. And it begins with a house that's in the Hamptons called the 6 Square House, and then it moves to a table that's called the Elephant Table, but that also is composed of 6 pieces. And then it moves into another building called the Rock House that's composed of 6 discrete elements. And in each of these, we're interested in a kind of ambiguity between, at moments, being able to perceive one of the units as a discrete piece, and then at other moments, it begins to coalesce and is understood as a singular monolithic mass. So in that sense, I think the scale of thinking about furniture, thinking about products versus the scale of thinking about buildings can be very similar. The kind of hierarchical understanding of part-to-whole relationships is kind of fundamental to any design project, regardless of its scale.
I think, where to begin? I mean, in that sense, being this multidisciplinary studio that we are, it gives us maybe sometimes the luxury of being very holistic. So we have developed a working methodology that we call Snøhetta Workshop, which is how we start most of our projects. If it's an opera, or even if it's maybe just a lamp, it's this moment where we invite our client in, and together we have 3 to 4 hours where we first zoom out to get to know the project. Then we zoom in, and then we make physical prototypes that in the end becomes creative starting points for a final concept for the project. When we do these, it allows us to be able to have a red thread that ties both building, space, visual identity, digital design, and products in harmony, in one harmony. So this doesn't mean that everything is made out of the same material. It doesn't mean that it's made of the same shape, but it comes from the same conceptual starting points. And one of those examples is, for example, the restaurant bar in Copenhagen, where the core concept was the sum of its ingredients, how things look very similar on a macro perspective, as well as a micro perspective. This informed the design in how the spaces were carved out, how the menus were, the websites, and it also informed even cutlery that we developed for this space with a carved out bit to it, so they both would stack better, fit better in the hand, but also ultimately to this finish of a stone wash, which took this from the ordinary polished stoneware into a more rugged feel, which actually saves a lot of man hours in not needing to polish the cutlery, which is sort of like a weird thing to think of, but that's actually almost a full-time job in some restaurants. So.
Brilliant.
Can you describe us this bar a little bit more visually, which materials you used? There was stone, just to make the listener understand, because we don't work
a
with
picture. Very much natural materials, mainly oak, and carving this place out. So in our studio too, we have we're lucky enough to have a 5-axis CNC machine where we get to do a lot of prototyping and can test these things out really big scale, which before you apply, before you develop a full facade, it's pretty good to be able to know how it feels full scale. In the same manner here, being able to develop these and with really good craftspeople to create the touch and feel that we went for.
Can I come over to your studio?
Anytime.
We are at a space now where we all have to think next, and that's the underlying belief and thought process behind Design Voices. When you were coming and flying down to Milan for Salone 60th edition, and after 3 years of break, what is one thing which you anticipated to see as the next thing?
We flew down here really hoping to see how these amazing companies and different studios have maybe taken our new reality a little bit more serious than what it has been. I think we are seeing a lot of that in terms of some terms of uncertainty, being honest about not knowing exactly what we can do and how we can do it. It's a lot about sharing knowledge, sharing experiences, and making that available for other studios, even competitors. I think we need to learn from the digital age that we're all part of, and even think of this a little bit, how most code is built up. The digital spaces that we all visit every day, they weren't created by one person. They've been created layer on layer on layer, making each development much more efficient because you already could take what has been shared, what has been developed. And that may be one of the ways that we can attack a little bit the future.
I was just going to add to that. It really feels to me that it's not one thing. We're at a time, specifically with the climate crisis, where we have to think about so many multiple facets to how we address the issues, from embodied energy to building locally to durability. And the way these very kind of complex issues integrate with each other doesn't necessarily manifest as a singular design solution. So in my mind, coming here, it's not to see one thing, but it's to see the ways in which different designers and different companies are beginning to integrate such complex problems that have to be solved.
Exactly, and it's that that mentality that seems to have shifted quite substantially for something better. And it's I love what you're saying with it's not a one solution solve all.
Yeah.
It's much more complex than that. And I think in that sense too, being able and celebrate projects and tests, even if they fail. It's without failure, we're not going to be able to push forward. So not being afraid of making something that isn't perfect is going to be super important. And maybe the sum of it parts can really make a difference.
You mentioned work in which you might have different materials. And what comes to mind for me is one of the charges from Palo Lenti for some of our collaboration is to, in fact, take one material to develop it to be a piece of furniture. And by virtue of the fact that it is singular and monolithic, the entirety of a piece can be recycled together. And so that's a new kind of problem where we think about fasteners and attachments, and it isn't necessarily constructed of multiple pieces that have to be disassembled at the end of its life. So
Great. Thank you, Bryan. And thank you, Marius. It was a pleasure talking to you and lending your voice for Design Voices by Salone and Stir. It's been a delight. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as we did. And thank you for being here. And
thank you.
And thank you for coming together after 3 years.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.